The Spanish Empire's role in shaping the United States is often overlooked. The Spanish had possessions in what would become the United States for over 400 years, at one point claimed the majority of what would become the contiguous U.S., and established a permanent settlement more than 40 years before the English founded their first. In this video, we'll look at the Spanish's contributions to U.S. culture, how they helped the U.S. win the American Revolutionary War, how and why the Spanish's influence is often overlooked, the tangible remains of the empire, and of course, a lot of old maps. We'll start with a familiar event, Christopher Columbus's contact with the Americas in 1492. When celebrating his discovery of the New World, the emphasis is often put on Columbus as an individual and his Italian heritage, but he was sailing for the Spanish. His Italian heritage is why Columbus Day is celebrated in the United States. Following the lynching of 11 Italian immigrants in 1891 in the city of New Orleans, President Benjamin Harrison declared the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage day as a one-time national celebration. This was part of an effort to ease hostilities against Italian Americans. In the following years, Italian Americans lobbied for it to become an annual federal holiday until it was successful in 1968, and it became effective in 1971. In 1493, the Spanish established their first settlement on Puerto Rico, the first in what would eventually become the United States. Its Spanish influence is obvious, but many forget that it's part of the United States since it's not a state. There are countless place names and structures. Spanish is the most widely spoken language. Catholicism is the most practiced religion, and most of the population has Spanish ancestry or African ancestry due to the importation of enslaved persons from the African continent. But this culture has spread outside of the island territory. Puerto Ricans have been serving in the U.S. military since World War I, and tens of thousands of Puerto Ricans still serve today, spreading their culture to other parts of the U.S. And many don't return back to the island. Out of around 9 million Puerto Ricans, around 2/3 live in the contiguous U.S. Just over 70 years later, Spanish explorers founded St. Augustine in Florida, which remains as the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in what is now the United States. It's unknown how many descendants of Spanish settlers currently exist. However, a few of the earliest settlers have been found to have between 500 to 1,000. You can still see some physical remains of the empire. Several structures were built during the Spanish period, the largest and most famous of which is Castillo de San Marcos, a masonry fort that began construction in 1672. The Florida flag was inspired by the flag of Spain. The red cross is reminiscent of the cross of Burgundy, which was used by Spanish conquistadors and settlers in Florida during the colonial period. The first European to spot Florida was likely Spanish explorer Juan Ponce De Leon. He arrived on the Florida peninsula on April 2, 1513. He named it La Florida, meaning flowery. Juan Ponce De Leon was searching for the legendary Fountain of Youth, a mythical spring that was believed to have the power to restore youth and vitality. Before I move on to the next region of Spanish colonization, I want to thank today's sponsor. They are who make these videos possible, so thank you BetterHelp for sponsoring this video. I could probably use therapy right now. I'm trying to increase the amount of content I make during 2024 while completing a master's degree, working a part-time job in the Army, and being a good dad and husband. I could probably use some stress and time management skills to improve efficiency. That way I have more quality time with family while also being more productive, which BetterHelp can help with. BetterHelp is a platform that makes finding and seeing a therapist easier because it's online. You simply fill out a few questions and you're matched with a professional therapist in as little as a few days. For example, if I went on and answered the questions, BetterHelp would match me with a therapist who has experience helping people manage stress and time management. It's not just clinical mental health issues like depression or anxiety that BetterHelp's therapist can help you with. If you're going through a hard time or just want to make some personal improvements and don't know where to start, BetterHelp can be a great option for you. BetterHelp aims to make therapy more affordable and more accessible, an important mission because finding a therapist can be hard. especially if there isn't a perfect fit for you and your area. It's easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. There's a link in my description. It's betterhelp.com/geographygeek. Clicking that link helps support this channel, but it also gets you 10% off your first month of BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. And if the therapist isn't a great fit, you can easily switch at no additional cost. So if you're struggling, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/geographygeek. The Spanish also had a strong presence in the Southwest, and claims that went much further. California, Nevada, Colorado, Montana, New Mexico, and Texas were all named by the Spanish, as well as the cities of Los Angeles, San Francisco, El Paso, Fresno, Santa Barbara, and many, many more. Dozens of missions have survived to today, the Alamo being the most well-known. But the culture didn't disappear when the Spanish lost their claims. Their cultural presence is so strong that it's been argued that the Southwest and northern Mexico are its own nation, named El Norte. The uniting characteristics include language, religion, and ethnicity. Of course, a large reason for this is the modern migration from Mexico and other Latin American countries, but it's not the only reason. Those of European descent have been in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado since the 1590s. Hundreds of thousands can trace their ancestry to the settlers that were there before the Southwest became part of the U.S. Santa Fe, founded in 1610, is the oldest U.S. state capital and home to the oldest government building and church outside of Puerto Rico. Colin Woodard wrote in his book, American Nations, "Within New Spain and later Mexico, the people of El Norte were seen as being more adaptable, self-sufficient, hard-working, aggressive, and intolerant of tyranny." This isn't completely unlike other regions of the U.S., or how many Americans would describe the country as a whole, or at least historically. I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that migrants from this area have helped spread these traits across the U.S., and they continue to today. According to the National Center for Farm Worker Health, 20% of today's agricultural workers were born in northern Mexico alone. These traits formed due to the remoteness of Spanish settlements. Resupplies from central Mexico only happened once every few years. The journey was long and through a harsh, arid climate. The Spanish Empire was also occupied fighting natives and other European powers, and this region wasn't exactly a priority given that they hadn't found any gold. The missions weren't even connected to each other. There were no roads, and hostile natives kept settlers from traveling far. This remoteness gave the northerners more freedom than the southerners. Mestizo, mulatto, and assimilated Indians could legally become full-blooded Spaniards, getting around the empire's caste system. In El Norte, farm workers could escape the oppression of large landowners by becoming sharecroppers. They could also move from farm to farm, seeking better conditions, with the exception of neophytes, native residents who had not finished their conversion to Catholicism and job training. Some of these workers spent great periods far away from the watch of their superiors. These self-sufficient ranch hands developed the iconic cowboy culture of the American West, building upon cattle ranching techniques first developed in southern Spain, an environment that isn't so different than El Norte. After all, the Spanish are who introduced horses and cattle to the Americas. The words associated with the culture, such as ranch, rodeo, bronco, buckaroo, mustang, bandolier, and stampede, are all of Spanish origin. It must be mentioned that millions of natives within what became the United States died because of the Spanish. This was due to wars, ethnic cleansing, enslavement, and newly introduced diseases. They aren't the only European power that had a hand in this. The U.S. itself did as well. But the Spanish began what's been called the greatest demographic disaster ever. It's unclear how many natives died as a result of the Spanish and European colonization as a whole. Pre-Columbian Native American population estimates by scholars widely vary, from about 4 to 15 million, but by the year 1800, it was only about 600,000. We can only speculate on how history may have been different if so many natives hadn't died. By the 18th century, Spain had lost its superpower status, but it was still a great power and played an important role in the United States winning the American Revolution. It's well known that France provided assistance to the American colonies, and I made an entire video on how the Netherlands did as well. But Spain also provided crucial support. Spain gave financial assistance, arms, ammunition, and other military supplies to the American colonies. Spain declared war on Britain in 1779. Although not directly allying with the American colonies, Spain's military actions in Europe and around the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean diverted British resources and attention. Spain's control of New Orleans allowed them to open the Mississippi River for American use. This was crucial to the transport of goods and supplies. But as the revolution was coming to a close, Spain wanted to keep fighting until they took back Gibraltar. So they proposed that they would stop if they were given everything west of the Appalachian Mountains. The British saw this as an opportunity to break the U.S. away from their new French and Spanish allies. So they offered a deal that would give the new country everything east of the Mississippi, north of Florida, and south of Canada. Before the establishment of the U.S. dollar, various foreign currencies circulated within the American colonies. Among these, the Spanish dollar, also referred to as the pieces of 8, was a predominant form of currency, and it may have been the origin of the dollar sign. However, the most widely accepted theory is that it evolved from the abbreviation PS, which stood for the Spanish peso, and gradually transformed and influenced the symbol we now recognize as the dollar sign. Outside of Puerto Rico, Florida, and the Southwest, it's rare to hear about the Spanish's influence on the U.S. It's common to find educational material about colonization that never mentions the Spanish other than Colombus. This video by Course Hero titled Early Attempts at Colonization of North America only talks about the English attempts. The curriculum framework of a high school course in my home state of Virginia gives the impression that the English were the first to make contact with what became the state of Virginia. It makes no mention that 40 years prior to the founding of Jamestown, a 15 to 20 man party of Spanish soldiers were in the western part of the state burning down a native village, or that the first European settlement in what would become the state of Virginia was Spanish. In 1570, a Spanish mission was established near the York River, but the entire party, except a young boy, was killed by natives. And in 1526, the Spanish established the first European settlement in what became the continental United States, in modern-day North Carolina. Their school curriculum also makes no mention of this. There's no clear reason why the Spanish's role in U.S. history is overlooked, but I can take a few educated guesses. For starters, the before-mentioned settlements weren't permanent, and their locations have never been found, so they don't attract much attention, whereas Jamestown sees 200,000 visitors a year. The story about how the U.S. purchased the Louisiana Territory from the French for next to nothing is a well-known story, but what's often left out was that the Spanish had traded the territory back to the French and handed it over just 3 weeks prior before the formal French handover to the U.S. Had the Spanish not traded, history may have been a little bit different. However, I think the largest reason for not knowing about the Spanish's role in U.S. history is the rivalry between the British and Spanish. The U.S., of course, formed by breaking away from Britain, but even as the country expanded west and south while absorbing other lands, it kept the idea that it was purely of English origin. I believe there is likely some anti-Catholicism to it as well. This was a reason for the British-Spanish rivalry after all, but colonists may have taken this to a new extreme. Many English settlers left Europe because they had experienced religious oppression from the Church of England, which they believed was too closely aligned with Roman Catholic traditions. This gave them an even deeper animosity towards Catholicism. In 1642, the colony of Virginia passed a law prohibiting Catholic settlers. 5 years later, the Massachusetts Bay Colony did the same. Anti-Catholicism was spread through the colonies and passed on through the generations. It was pretty common until the 20th century. Anti-Catholicism still exists in the U.S. today, though it's not nearly as widespread as it once was. But still, the biases of our ancestors may have been passed on, whether we realize it or not. Hopefully this video helped to correct some of those biases. I'll admit that I didn't know much about Spanish influence on the US until reading comments on a related Dutch influence video I made. This was one of my longer videos, but still, there's a lot missing. So what other ways have the Spanish left their mark on American culture? Let me know in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you all for watching.